Welcome, everyone. We are at the top of the hour, so we'll go ahead and get started with our webinar today. Hello and welcome. My name is Melanie Ross, and I will be your presenter and the facilitator today for our webinar. Thank you for joining ANAB for our complimentary webinar on Let's Talk Types of Audits. Please note, we are recording this webinar, so it will be available for viewing in the future. Some logistics before we get started. Due to the high attendance, everyone will remain muted for the duration of the webinar. Please enter your questions into the Q&A box. I have planned time at the end of the webinar to answer any questions that you may have. Just a little bit about me before we get going. I am a technical products developer for ANAB. I create technical content for our training, for our webinars such as these, and for new programs and updated programs. I am a lead assessor for many different standards, including 17025 and 17020. And again, I develop content for training and education on conformity assessment topics. With that, we're going to go ahead and get into our webinar today on types of audits. When we look at internal auditing, we can look at these audits from different perspectives. We can look at our audits from the viewpoint of the auditor, and we can also look at a variety of different ways to perform internal audits. These ways include in-person and remote, as well as the techniques in order to perform the audits. So as part of this webinar today, we are going to dive into the different viewpoints of the different audits that could be a part of your management system, and a brief overview of the ways to perform the audits. When we look at the different viewpoints of audits within our management system, we can have first-party, second-party, and third-party audits, and I will define each of those, providing some examples as well here in a second. Oftentimes, our internal audit program, or our audit program in general, I should stop using the word internal, only contains those first-party audits. They contain our internal audits. But what we're going to challenge you to think about today during this webinar is looking at how second-party and third-party audits can also benefit your organization if they are incorporated into your management system. Our first type of audit is these first-party audits. First-party audits are performed by individuals from the organization or hired by the organization, such as a contractor. These are what we think of as internal audits. We're looking at our management system, our operations, manufacturing, testing, calibration, all of those things from a first person's perspective. If you're familiar with internal audits in any way, you know that these audits are more thorough and in-depth because the individuals performing the audit are familiar with the organization and the processes and activities that are being performed. We use our internal audits to identify opportunities for improvement, as well as any risks and inefficiencies. Sometimes these first-party audits are also used as a gap analysis to look at specific requirements and to see how the system meets or doesn't meet those requirements when we're implementing new things into our management system. We typically use these first-party audits not only to conform with requirements to the standard, but to prepare for our external audits as well. Overall, our first-party or internal audits should assist us in finding weaknesses within our organization and within our management system so that those can be corrected or resolved through corrective action to eliminate those weaknesses. And when I use the word weakness, that can be considered an opportunity for improvement, a risk, an inefficiency, or something that we identify as a nonconformity, a non-fulfillment of a requirement. These internal or first-party audits also assist us in aligning our operations with our objectives. When we look at the goal of a first-party audit, the goal is an internal strengthening of the management system and overall operations. So again, we're looking at our organization or our management system or our operations from a first-party perspective to identify any of those weaknesses and strengthen the organization through correction or corrective action. The second type of audits that could be a part of your management system are second-party audits. In these second-party audits, individuals from outside the organization with a vested interest in the organization perform these audits. So we think of, from our perspective, a vendor or supplier or subcontractor to our organization. We may send individuals out to perform an audit of those vendors or suppliers, and this would be a second-party audit. We evaluate portions of the management system of that organization from a second-person perspective. We're outside the organization, but as a supplier to us, we have a vested interest in the management system and the activities that are being performed in relation to what's being supplied to our organization. Second-party audits also could be customers of our organization. So maybe we have specified contracts with specific customers, and in those contracts, we allow individuals to come in to perform audits. While these second-party audits may be a distraction from day-to-day operations, they are a valuable source of information within a limited scope, depending on what's being audited, for the management system that is being audited. Oftentimes, these second-party audits are used to determine compliance with contractual terms or customer-defined criteria if not in a contract. Just like with first-party audits, these second-party audits also identify risks and opportunities, but we're more, as the auditors, looking at risks and opportunities to our own organization in relation to the management system of the vendor or supplier or subcontractor that we're auditing. In these audits, they can also be used to evaluate performance for a specific product or service being provided to us or being provided to our customers in an audit of our organization. These audits have limited scopes depending on how they're defined based on the contract or that customer-defined criteria. And we can use the information gathered in those audits to improve our own management system. So when we look at it from a vendor or supplier perspective, most of the standards, whether we're looking at management system standards like 9001 or testing standard like 17025, is required to evaluate our vendors to determine their performance. Sometimes that's a survey, sometimes it's reviewing the work that's being performed, and other times, as resources allow or in high-risk situations, we can use audits to perform that surveillance of our vendors or suppliers. It is a mechanism for us to use to feed back into our own management system changes to our vendor or supplier program or changes to our own operations, maybe within receipt of materials from a specific supplier. And these second-party audits are also important to the vendor or supplier being audited because they can take the criteria and information from the audit that you're performing of them and improve their management system as well. The goal of our second-party audit is to identify supply chain risks that could impact operations of our organization, the organization performing the audit. We can use these audits to ensure suppliers meet specific requirements defined by the organization or the product or service provided. Now, the last viewpoint for our audit program could include these third-party audits. Third-party audits are performed by individuals completely independent of the organization being audited. Oftentimes, these third-party audits are regulatory, certification, or accreditation audits. The auditors or assessors in the accreditation realm evaluate the management system from a third-person perspective against criteria defined in regulations and/or standards, depending on the type of audit. These third-party audits can be used by the organization as external validation of the operations and the management system. Now, when we say validation, this is different than validating a method. This is saying validation that our management system meets requirements or identifying opportunities for improvement, risks, or nonconformities if the operations don't meet requirements. These third-party audits often end in some sort of certification or accreditation or approval in the sense of a regulatory audit, and they can enhance customer confidence in the products and services provided. Just like with first and second party audits, third-party audits also can identify those risks, opportunities, and nonconformities, but oftentimes the evaluation is a little more systematic because it is guided by the standards or regulations that are the criteria for that audit. This third-party perspective, while a certification body or accreditation body may have an interest in your becoming certified or accredited, they are completely independent of your organization. They don't provide input to the management system, and they don't receive output from the management system in terms of products or services provided. The goal of our third-party audits are to provide evidence, to provide an objective evaluation of compliance, risk, and performance to enhance marketability and demonstrate commitment to meeting defined requirements. Again, these third-party audits often end with certification or accreditation as a result of the audit, and the organization can display their certificate of certification or accreditation and provide that to their customers to enhance that marketability and to provide more confidence in the activities that are being performed by the organization. Now, since we've looked at the different viewpoints of audits that could be a part of our management system, I want to dive into different ways to perform our audits. When we're performing an audit, whether it's first party, second party, or third party, we can look at the activities or processes in different ways. And two of the different ways is how we look at the information and the processes in general. We can perform a horizontal audit or a vertical audit. A horizontal audit is where one process across many departments or functions is evaluated. We follow the process from start to end, and I will give a little more detailed example here in a second. In a vertical audit, all processes and activities undertaken by a department or function are subject to the audit. This is looking up and down within a department or a function within the management system or organization. When we look at horizontal audits a little more deeply, a horizontal audit is when you audit one process across many departments in the organization. One example could be if you choose to only look at document control everywhere it happens throughout the organization, or are only focused on training records across many departments. This type of audit has one big limitation. It is difficult to see the linkages between processes, and it doesn't look at the concept of the management system as a whole. If you're only looking at document control, you may not easily see how this is related to the records kept of the process, or how document control can affect the process of ordering supplies or serving the customer, for example. These linkages between processes can oftentimes cause problems and highlight great opportunities for improvement, and these can be overlooked if we're narrowly focused on one process. On the other hand, if we're doing an audit as a follow-up to ensure that a corrective action is effectively implemented, then this horizontal audit as a standalone could be an excellent tool. For example, in a previous audit, you found that record control was incorrectly maintained in several departments, and now you're verifying that it's been fixed after a planned correction or corrective action. Then we may just look at record control across many departments in the organization as a way to make sure that it's now done correctly after the improvements were made to the management system. On the other hand, our vertical audits is when we audit all processes or most processes used by a department. It could be done when we audit, say, the purchasing department and do a review of purchasing processes, documentation, the training records, records retention, corrective actions, non-conforming product, contract review, etc. It is done one process at a time. When using this type of audit, different procedures interact across the management system, and you can more easily see the linkages between procedures. It is easier to determine if there is a problem between the different processes as well. In fact, if you're doing several vertical audits near each other, it can become easy to see if there is a systemic problem across many processes using that horizontal look as well, or if you have an isolated problem within just one department. For example, if you find that there is a problem with the information recorded in the contract as it is used by the purchasing department and the design department and the production department, you could focus corrective action on improving the entire contract process rather than focusing on the one department that is having problems with the information. So if you've ever heard vertical or horizontal audits before, or if you think about how you perform audits as an auditor or how you would if you're planning on being an auditor, typically we use a blend of horizontal and vertical looks in the organization to fulfill our audit objectives to evaluate the audit criteria that's set for that internal audit. There are a few examples that I have mentioned where horizontal only and vertical only makes sense, but as auditors, we typically flow between. One reason for specifically internal audits is we want to learn from the mistakes, so to speak, of one department into the next. If there are issues with document control in each department or several departments, several areas of the organization, it only makes sense to evaluate it and correct and provide corrective action from a management system perspective rather than department by department trying to evaluate that, because this example of document control exists throughout the entire organization. So a more systemic or systematic approach to correcting a nonconformity such as document control would make more sense than doing it in isolation in different departments. Other ways to look at ways to perform our audits, whether we're doing first party, second party, or third party audits, is are we going to perform these audits in person or are we going to perform these audits remotely? Most of the time, our first person audits can be done in person because we're internal to the organization and we can plan to perform those audits at times that work well for the auditee or the area being audited. Remote audits do have their place in internal auditing if you're a larger organization or if travel is an issue or maybe interviews are done remotely, something like that. And remote audits can also be a good way to get our second party audits completed with limited resources and limited funding for those audits. Obviously, with the remote audit, travel is not a consideration, the expense of travel. So they may be able to be performed more cost effectively than those in-person audits. When you're thinking about in-person versus remote, you really want to look at the risk to completing the audit based on the audit objectives. Are you able to meet the audit objectives if you perform a remote audit? There are some downsides to being remote in not being able to really view the processes being performed or use just your visual observations while you're standing in the area where the work is being done. That's a challenge when you're only looking through a camera. So just keep that in mind as you think about what would serve your audit program and what works best for those first and second party audits. And then for the third party audits, it's up to the regulator or the certification body or accreditation body in determining those in-person versus remote audits. Diving a little bit deeper down into in-person versus remote. When we're in person, obviously we can conduct interviews, We can complete the checklist with the auditee's participation. So have in a room sitting together discussing that checklist and gathering information and getting that information in real time. We can perform sampling of records more easily because we're on site and can view where the records are stored rather than those records being pulled and provided remotely. And we can also more easily observe the work being performed. I already mentioned that briefly. When we are remote, we can conduct that document review. We do that in person as well. But off-site, we can perform that document review, especially in the digital age where we can get our documents shared through some kind of file sharing platform. We can complete our checklists, which are typically based on the documents as they are reviewed. And we can analyze data that's provided to us. So again, this is just to show that there are pluses and minuses for both in-person and remote, and to have those considerations in mind, not just considering cost of travel or feasibility of the audit, but also the risks that come with being remote versus being in person. When we look at ways to perform in a different perspective, now we're looking at ways to perform the audit. What activities do we use in order to perform our audit? What methods do we use? There are different methods for performing an audit, and I picked 4 for our webinar today. We have document review, which we saw on that previous slide. We have observation and witnessing, and I'm going to go into the difference of the two. And we have interviewing. We're going to dive into each of these in a little bit more detail as well. When we look at those audit methods, first, we look at different ways of performing the audit methods where we can have human interaction or we could have no human interaction. And the ISO 19011 guidelines for auditing management systems defines the difference between human interaction and no human interaction. And the point of this slide today is to just get you thinking of how your audits can be completed with consideration of the resources that are needed. So if you're going into an area that has a high throughput and they need to stay on task, you may use more of the non-human interaction activities in your audits and rather than relying on the human interaction. Now, a blend of both of these is important in any type of audit that you're performing in order to meet your audit objectives and effectively evaluate that audit criteria. So with human interaction, we think of things like interviewing, right? We're going to be talking to the people doing the work, asking them questions, and them answering those questions. We have to have that human interaction to perform the interview. We can also complete checklists with the auditee, with the individuals being audited, but we can also, on the no human interaction side, complete checklists, again, just based on that document review or record review. In this human interaction, we have that sampling. That's word is there again. We use sampling in our internal audits because we can't look at everything, but we have to ask for those samples. We have to interact with the auditee to determine how many records to look at for a specific process. Where are those records stored and how are they going to be shared? And then obviously observing work or performing witnessing, we would have interaction with the individuals where we're observing that work. On the flip side, it's what we saw before. The no human interaction is that document review, analyzing data, and then again, completing checklists, which we can do on our own with no interaction, but we get better results if we interact with the auditee in filling out that checklist or completing it to its finality. So the first method that we had on our slide previously was document review. And there's 2 different document review activities that could be a part of your internal audit. The first one is prior to going on site or going into the area being audited in looking at the documentation that's provided prior to the audit. This allows us as auditors to understand to some degree the auditee's operations, whether that's internal to your organization from a first-party perspective or for a supplier or vendor from a second party perspective. Reading their procedures, reviewing some of the records, looking at process flows, organizational charts, gives us a high level view of the operations that are going to be subject of the audit. It can also help us as auditors to prepare for the audit activity. We can start filling out our checklist. We can get our audit work documents prepared. We can decide what interviews we may need to perform or what processes we want to observe or witness. We can start to form questions to ask of the auditee as well. It also gives us the opportunity as a first look to determine possible conformity to audit criteria. Now, our document review alone cannot determine conformity because we've not seen the process being performed and verified that what was written is actually what's being done. So we just determine potential or possible conformity or nonconformity, I suppose, to the audit criteria, and it can give us areas of concern. So are there areas where the documents don't even meet the requirement? Then that would be something that we would want to talk about during the audit, during that human interaction portion of the audit. The second document review that may be a part of your audits is document review during the audit. This is looking further into the records that are being generated for the process that's being performed, looking at other documents such as training records or competency records, looking at traceability records, all those things that we're going to be looking at as part of the audit of the process or activity. And that allows us to gather what's called objective evidence to determine conformity of the management system with the requirements. So we say audit criteria here. These are the requirements that are the subject of the audit. It allows the auditors to gather information to support the audit activities, to support what you've observed, what you've talked about during your interviews, what you may have witnessed during the audit, if that is a part of your internal audit process. Our next method is observation. So observation is different than witnessing. Observation is actively observing our physical surroundings and the activities that are being performed. It's one of the most important tools that auditors can use to gather objective evidence. As auditors, we should be aware of the surrounding activities as well as the activities that are being observed. As auditors, we need to be quick to notice things. So our observations can be done during a tour of the facility or the area that's being audited. Our observations can be as we stand there interviewing someone. We can see the facilities, the environmental conditions, the equipment. We're always looking and observing as we're performing the audit in order to gather more objective evidence to demonstrate conformance to requirements. So again, we can see the storage conditions, non-technical processes that are being performed, those facilities and environmental conditions, the layout of the area where the work is being performed, efficiency of people walking around, the documents, the records that they're filling out. Are they holding the correct form? Where do they get that form? There's lots of things of objective evidence that we can gather as part of our observations during the audit. Taking observation one step further is then when we call it witnessing. Now, this is something that is performed by accreditation bodies when they perform an accreditation assessment, and it's encouraged to be performed during your internal audits. Nothing I've said today is standing as requirements for your internal audit program. I like to say that before I get into witnessing, and we definitely want you to refer to your certification body or accreditation body for any additional requirements for internal audits that you perform as part of a certified or accredited management system. But if you do incorporate witnessing into your internal audits, it's often called method witnessing or technical competence evaluation. And the reason that this is somewhat of a challenge to incorporate into an internal audit program is because our auditors may not have the technical competency to evaluate if the person or process or machine or method is also therefore competent, the method is valid in order to get the intended results. So you may incorporate some form of witnessing into your internal audit, not for the purpose of determining technical competence, but just to gather additional objective evidence that may not be gathered in the simple act of observation. So you may delineate between those two activities, where our observation is when we're walking through the area and we notice something. And this method witnessing is an intentional activity where we observe the process being performed. Here it says test or calibration. It could be any activity or process. We obviously already review the procedure, but now we're taking it one step further and saying, where did this procedure come from? Does it come from a standard method? Does it come from a regulatory requirement? And are those standard method requirements in that procedure? We're interviewing personnel, but we're asking more technical questions, and we're inspecting the equipment and the related records to look at traceability and not just are the records there. So it's just going one step further in that observation process. And if you call all of it observation in your internal audit program or your vendor supplier audit program, it's perfectly fine. The standard for 17025 basically just has a couple words that say, do your audits to evaluate your management system, including laboratory activities. And it's up to the organization to determine what that best practice is for your organization. Regardless of what standards drive your management system, it is unique to your organization based on the risks of the activities, processes being performed, the availability of auditors, and their knowledge of the process being performed. When we look at witnessing during internal audits, just to drive this point home, your internal auditors may not possess the technical expertise of the method being witnessed. And that's okay, right? They're not assessors, they're not performing an accreditation assessment, they're performing an internal audit. They can, however, compare the contents of the procedure with the standard method where it came from, if applicable. They can say, the standard method says XYZ, our procedure says XYZ, those two match. That's objective evidence, and that's confirmation of conformance of the procedure to the standard method. Then going one step further for witnessing is watching the people perform the work and saying, does the performance of the method meet the procedure that meets the standard method? So that's where witnessing can be incorporated into your internal audit. They're not declaring competence of the process or procedure or activity or method. They're saying, here's the requirement, standard method, here's the procedure. And when they performed it, they followed that procedure, and the records they generated were the records the procedure said that they would generate. So just to wrap up observation versus witnessing, our observation is general attention to or watching surroundings and activities when walking through an area where work is performed. It can evaluate conformance and or competence depending on what activity we're looking at. So for example, walking through an area where work is performed, we're looking at individuals having access to the equipment and resources that they need to perform the work. Again, witnessing is that direct observation or intentional act of watching authorized personnel perform tasks, activities, or processes. It also evaluates conformance and can evaluate competence, depending again on the activity that's being performed and the audit criteria that the audit is based on. This could be watching an analyst weigh and prepare samples, or watching an analyst perform a test or measurement method. The next audit method that we have on our list is interviewing. And I just want to go over quickly some tips about interviewing. These come again from that ISO 19011 guideline for auditing management systems. We want to make sure we interview individuals from appropriate levels and functions, conduct our interviews during normal business hours when possible, and conduct it at the normal workplace. Now, you may be thinking remote audits would not be conducted at the normal workplace. So this is where it can be. So if it's not safe to perform an interview where work is being performed, maybe the interview is done in a conference room instead. The biggest thing as auditors that we can learn as we do interviews is to put the individual being interviewed at ease. Let them know that you are there because they are the expert and you're asking them about the process they're performing, and you want them to be as less nervous as possible to be able to provide the answers to the questions that you ask. Now we go back to that first box where we want to hold those interviews from appropriate levels and functions. If we ask a question of an auditee that they are not authorized or do not know the answer to, they may feel obligated to answer because we are auditors, but we want to make sure that we're asking those questions to the appropriate levels and functions of the organization and verifying information if it was given to us by somebody that may be guessing or doesn't know the correct answer. Again, we explain why we're performing the interview, and I like to explain any notes that I'm taking so that they know what I'm writing down. I'm writing down the answers to my questions, and then any follow-ups that I may be. Best practice is to ask the individual to describe what they do, describe the process and how they perform it. We want to talk about different types of questions as well. There are closed and open questions that we can use and clarifying questions. We want to make sure we select those types of questions carefully, as well as being aware of our nonverbal communication. Our nonverbal communication, as well as the interviewee's nonverbal communication. If they start getting anxious or upset, rerouting the questions, maybe asking some of those closed questions so they can get a few wins in their answers. Be aware of our nonverbal communication, that we're not looking bored or looking around the room or looking at the clock, and that we're nodding to show understanding and things like that. It's always good to summarize what you talked about in the audit and thank the individual for performing, summarize the results of the interview and thank the individual for taking the time to participate in that interview. So in interviewing, we want to make sure that we're talking to the people that are doing the work. We listen to the answers that they provide as objectively as possible and compare those answers to other objective evidence. So to other records, to the procedure, to other interviews, manuals, process flows, things like that. And then we seek clarification as needed. So we've gone through the different audit methods. We've looked at the ways to look at the organization, talked about in-person and remote, first, second, and third party. Now I want to look at just the audit program as a whole to kind of round out our webinar today. When you think about your audit program, you need to think about what drives the audit program. Oftentimes, our audit programs are driven by the standard tells us we need an audit program, whether it's a management system standard or a conformity assessment standard. So that standard drives our audit program. It says that we have to evaluate our suppliers. If we want to be certified or accredited, we have to have those third-party audits. And it tells us we have to do internal audits. That's just one driver of an audit program. There are many other drivers that could be behind your audit program, and if not, considerations for improvements to your audit program. It could be driven by your organization. Maybe your management system is new and you need more internal audits and you have more customer audits than if you had a more mature management system. It could be an organizational initiative to have process improvements across the organization, and those could be found and worked through as part of the internal audit program. Our clients or our customers also drive our audit program. Without our customers, we wouldn't have a business. So our audit program ensures or should ensure that our management system is robust, that it's effectively implemented and maintained. So our clients could drive that management or that audit program just by demand, or they could drive it through contract requirements or other client-defined requirements. Other parts of your audit program could be industry driven. If there are certain industry requirements for performing internal audits or industry requirements as part of your management system, those could be incorporated into your audit program through first and second party audits as well. Then that regulatory or regulation driven, and there could be other motivations. So what I would encourage everyone to do, and I do encourage in our internal auditor course, is to think about what the drivers are for your audit program. What are the drivers for your management system? And does your audit program cater to those drivers? Does your audit program incorporate the different drivers or reasons behind having an audit program? Or is it just that first line item that it's because the standard tells us we have to? The better understanding of your drivers, the more value you'll get out of your internal audit program. Now, I say components of a robust audit program here, and this comes from the previous slide. Oftentimes we think of our audit program as our internal audits. We have our internal audit schedule, we have our internal auditors, we perform those audits based on the schedule, we report the results, we tie it up in a nice neat bow, and we say there's our audit program. But what I hope this webinar has gotten you to think about with our viewpoints is that our audit program can also include those customer audits, our supplier vendor audits that we go out and do, our regulatory audits, if applicable, and those certification or accreditation audits or assessments. Information and results from all of these different audits, all of these different viewpoints of your management system can come together to help improve your management system, which ultimately could improve your overall operations and foster a culture of quality within your organization. So to summarize here, we have different perspectives. Our viewpoints can be first party, second party, third party audits. We can have in-person or remote audits. We can use a variety of different ways to perform our audits, a blend of horizontal and vertical, or focused strictly on horizontal or strictly on vertical. We can incorporate observation. We can go one step further to witnessing and having interviews and document review and all those other aspects of an audit into our first and second party audits to make those audits more robust. Then we also want to consider the motivations for our audit program. What are the drivers behind needing an audit program and maintaining an audit program? And what are the components of our audit program? Is it just internal audits, or does it also include those second party and third party audits as well? All right, so we have had a few questions come through, but in order to give you more time to find the Q&A panel and ask any questions that you may have, I want to go over some additional resources that ANAB has available for organizations, whether you are certified, accredited, or not. We have many different media that can further your understanding of standards, accreditation, management systems, and assessments. On our website, we have free webcasts on a variety of topics. They are about 5 to 20 minutes long, depending on the topic, and can be viewed at any time. ANAB also has a blog page with a wealth of information related to risk, accreditation, standard requirements across many different standards, and many other topics. We also do these webinars monthly. We will be having another webinar in February. And keep an eye out on our website for our webinar schedule, because sometimes we do 2 a month. Our webinars are recorded, and those recordings are also available on our website at the web address on the slide here. We also offer training in many different areas, including internal auditing, such as this topic today, standards, risk, and many other topics. Most of our courses are now live online. We do offer private and open registration courses, and our online courses include exercises and discussions related to the topic at hand to further solidify the content that's being presented. We also have a large catalog of self-paced courses as well. All of these resources can be found on our website at anab.ansi.org. And now we will get into your questions. So if you have any questions, you can open that Q&A panel and ask the question. The first question that we had is, could you comment on the relationship of first-party audit as preparation for a third-party audit? Can this be part of the design of a first-party audit? Is that common? So I can talk about the relationship. Our first-party audits are those internal audits. I mentioned that. And in our internal audits, we can be a little more open because we are internal to the organization. It's our first-party perspective. We may have knowledge of areas where there may be issues, and we can kind of target those areas, not with bias, but to go in and look at those areas that may have more risk or more customer complaints, so to speak, or something like that, and look at those areas for improvements before our third-party auditors come in and find the issues. If you've ever heard of shaking the tree, so we can shake the tree to fetter out any issues that may arise before that third-party audit. And it can be a design of your first-party audit. That's one of the reasons, as quality manager Melanie, not ANAB employee Melanie, but quality manager Melanie encourages witnessing to some degree as part of your internal audits, because then your personnel are used to having someone watch them do their work, and they get a little more comfortable with it when they have the auditor or the assessor observing them do their work as part of the certification or accreditation audit. As far as is it common, I've seen it a variety of different ways of organizations setting up their internal audit programs through my own experience, as well as through assessing laboratories and inspection bodies. So it really just depends on the needs of your organization. Again, those drivers to your audit program. Preparing your people for external audits, whether it's a second party or third party, is a benefit to them because it makes them more comfortable, hopefully, in being audited by someone external to the organization. And then it also helps you find any issues before that third party audit occurs. And then the next question, why do you believe that drivers and motivations have an impact on auditing, and which ones would be the most relevant? So I would say the drivers and motivations have an impact on your audit program if your audit program is set up to benefit the management system and operations, and not just a check the box exercise because the standard tells you to. So thinking of your audits as a way to bolster contract review, thinking of your audits as a way to ensure that customer requirements are met or regulatory requirements are met, is one way to assist in improving your organization, your management system. It's not required. This is just an idea of how to make your internal audits work for you. And which ones would be the most relevant, again, is really based on the context of your organization. Do you have regulations that guide your organization? Do you have customer contracts or contracts with suppliers, things like that? That really is going to determine what those drivers would be. And then the next one, we are 17025 and was wondering when you are billing a customer for a calibration, do you have to say which items are ISO certified? So that question is outside the scope of this webinar. So I'm going to take note of it and I will email you from our ANAB at anab.org email address and ask for a little more context and see if I can get you pointed to the right person. And then the next one, as a consulting firm, what is the process to get ANAB accreditation? So that is also kind of outside the scope of this webinar. However, I encourage you, if you are seeking accreditation, to go on our website and submit a request for quote. It's a very simple form to fill out. It just gives us basic information about what you're seeking. And then that way an account executive can call and talk to you about the process and what the best options are for you for accreditation. So anybody that's thinking about that, you can do that as well. And that request for quote doesn't obligate you to anything. It's just getting your information so that we can then reach out with the appropriate people to talk to you. The discussion of observation versus witnessing was great. Thank you. Is there an observation requirement that requires documentation, or is this more of awareness to be well aware and observe? So there's no requirements on how you perform your internal audits. Like I said, halfway through the webinar, what we're discussing today is best practices, is ideas from the 19,011 guidelines, good practices that I've seen as an assessor, but none of it is required. So what is required is what comes out of those drivers, those standards, whichever standard you are accredited to or certified to, what those requirements are, and then any requirements of your certification body or accreditation body, or any requirements of your customers or internally that you've set yourself. As far as requiring observation, that's kind of a hard one because we're all different in the ways that we perform our audits and we all see different things when we're observing. If you've ever done one of those, look at this video and see what you observe, everyone sees different things. So I think encouraging your internal auditors to be observant, that's one of the attributes of good internal auditors, is to be observant and to work on their observation skills during their internal audits, that it can just improve your internal audits overall. And then the last one that I see here is there a set of standardizations that most audits follow? I would say, depending on the vast people that are here, because we did have well over 300 people attend the live webinar, I could say there's no set of standards for internal audits. It's really dependent on the needs of your organization, the risks related to the processes that are and activities that are being audited. But if you do want some sort of guideline, the ISO 19011 guideline is a very good resource for developing an audit program for management systems and for developing internal auditors. It is focused on first-party audits, but the guidelines and guidance in that standard can fill in those second-party audits as well. Not a requirement to use 19011, just a resource that is available to you out there. And then the last question that came in, can we get a copy of the presentation? This webinar has been recorded and the recording will be up on our website probably by the beginning of next week, if not tomorrow. So if you didn't catch the whole webinar or you had coworkers or colleagues that couldn't make it, you can send them to our website to view the recording in the future. So I want to thank everyone for coming to the webinar today and to let you know that for additional information related to training, you can contact our training department at training@anab.org. Or if you have any additional information that you'd like related to accreditation services, again, you could submit an RFQ, request for quote, on our website, or you could email anab@anab.org, and we will be happy to assist you. If you're watching this webinar in the future, either of those email addresses will get the question to me as the presenter today, So feel free to email either of those email addresses if you have any questions about the topics here or any other internal auditing or accreditation related questions. Before I wrap up the webinar, I'm going to check to see if there's any other questions. And we are an ISO 17025 lab. Do we need to use that ISO checklist as part of our internal audit? There are no requirements in the 17025 standard to use a checklist for your audit. Oftentimes, laboratories do use a checklist. They use the checklist that is provided by their accreditation body. I would say that's one tool for your internal audits and shouldn't be your whole toolbox. But again, check with your accreditation body to see what their requirements are for performing internal audits, if there are any specific documentation requirements. And that was the last question that came in. Just some thank yous from you, the people that were here today. I appreciate you coming and listening to this webinar, and I hope it gave you something to think about. Have a great rest of your day.